Madam President of the General Assembly, distinguished heads of state and government, distinguished ministers of foreign affairs, ladies and gentlemen. This is my third address to the United Nations General Assembly. It is without doubt an immense privilege and an honor to represent Paraguay in this magnificent forum, a country which may look small on the map, but is a giant in its spirit and potential. As I flew into New York from afar, I was thinking that I might begin my speech by sharing the joy that I feel at having the opportunity to tell you about the great things that lie ahead for Paraguay. However, the events of recent days and months make this simply impossible. Instead, with regret, I must begin by recalling the anecdote of the great German historian Theodor Mommsen, who, upon receiving the Nobel Prize in 1903, asked his audience not to applaud after his acceptance speech. "The times," he said sorrowfully, "are too grave for that." The years that followed fully confirmed his intuition. I believe exactly the same thing can be said today. Indeed, in recent times we have witnessed that evil, radical ideologization, intolerance are unfortunately real and embedded in certain sectors of our societies. I remain shaken, saddened, and distressed by the shocking images of two cowardly and incomprehensible political attacks. First, intolerance and hatred which took the life of a great human being, Miguel Uribe, the Colombian presidential pre-candidate who was assassinated in public while touring while on a national tour. Ghosts of violence which we thought were a thing of the past for our Colombian brothers and sisters. Second, we saw a young dreamer, Charlie Kirk, who was miserably torn from his wife and 2 children for one sole sin, defending his convictions and values with eloquence and courage. Both men, rather than resorting to violence to impose their ideas, chose the most civic and peaceful method possible: free, open, and frank debate, without evading controversial positions, yet always within a framework of respect. The ominous, macabre response must awaken us from our slumber of complacency. Dear friends, our values, our very way of life are at risk. The idea of democracy, that venerable and brilliant creation of Greek genius which allows us to have a peaceful modus vivendi despite our differences, is currently in jeopardy. Therefore, in times when darkness seeks to extinguish the light, we must take a stand. This is no time to be timid. Either we stand on the right side of peace and reason, or we stand with violence and intolerance. Our children and grandchildren will not forget the stance that we took when faced with the immense challenge before us. That's why I wish to be very clear with you. Political violence is immoral, intolerable, and profoundly harmful. We must reject it without equivocation. So let's say loudly and clearly no to hatred, no to violence, and no to authoritarianism. We mustn't underestimate the gravity of what's happening. These aren't isolated events, they are patterns. The situation has been worsening in light of political movements. There is polarization and extremism that were once subtly revealed in texts and speeches that are now today materializing in acts of real violence. There is a crisis of belief in institutions. Citizens simply no longer have trust. Our democracy, this is a democracy which for decades guaranteed the most basic human rights, embodied in that magnificent instrument which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the everlasting achievement of the United Nations system, is under siege from all quarters, both on the left and the right. And this, ladies and gentlemen, might be a path of no return. This crisis situation is the perfect breeding ground for authoritarianism, where democratic values are eroded. Authoritarianism, or its perverse twin, populism, replaces it. Paraguay views with great concern the restrictions on the exercise of fundamental rights, such as access to free information and freedom of expression in some sister countries. These are already palpable demonstrations that the crisis is real and far-reaching. Thus, regrettably, the situation in Venezuela has become truly alarming. Systematic violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms are being compounded by actions that are contrary to international law and the persecution of political leaders. The electoral process in July 2024 trampled the will of the Venezuelan people. 7 million Venezuelans have left their homeland. This is the largest migratory crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere. In Nicaragua, meanwhile, the persecution of political opponents persists and is expanding aggressively. The situation of human rights and fundamental guarantees is dire. Entire religious orders have been expelled. Hundreds of Nicaraguans have been stripped of their nationality for the sole crime of dissenting. Even the Catholic Church is being persecuted, something that was once unthinkable in Latin America. Paraguay knows better than most the calamity of authoritarianism and dictatorship, having lived through the longest military regime on the continent in the 20th century. The scars of this have not yet fully healed. We therefore cannot and must not stand silent while our Latin American brothers and sisters suffer the same oppression that marked our own past. The crisis of democracy, friends, will not be resolved with an iron fist, nor with censorship, nor authoritarianism, much less so still with violence. We must resist these alluring impostors. As the Italian philosopher Norberto Bobbio said, crises of democracy are resolved in one way only, with more democracy. Not with authoritarian charlatans, nor with hatred or intolerance. We must respond with more democracy, more republicanism, more tolerance, more dialogue, more rights, more freedom. The raison d'être, the essence of the United Nations, is and shall remain the maintenance of peace. Yet, while we are meeting here, more than 120 armed conflicts show just how serious the failure of our institutions can be. Paraguay extends its solidarity to all victims of armed conflict and calls once again for the peaceful settlement of disputes. I stress today in particular the painful situation in Haiti. The time for decisive and coordinated action by the United Nations, and in particular the Security Council, is now. Paraguay knows this and stands ready to assist the Haitian people who can wait no longer. Furthermore, I wish to highlight a situation that goes beyond armed conflict, but which highlights the same seriousness. We are facing a silent but devastating crisis, the collapse of global supply chains. The pandemic showed us just how fragile they were. The war in Ukraine strained them further, and now geopolitical fragmentation threatens to break them definitively. The world urgently needs supply chains that are more reliable, more diversified, more resilient. We cannot continue depending on systems that place efficiency above security, cost above reliability. I want to be clear here. Not all trade partnerships are the same. We must be cautious about deceptive economic models that come along with political authoritarianism, mass surveillance, and the erosion of fundamental freedoms. When we agree to investments that compromise our sovereignty, when we allow our critical infrastructure to depend on authoritarian regimes, we simply are gambling with not only our economy but also our democracy. Therefore, we call for deeper integration among our countries based not only on trade but on shared values. These are the rule of law, individual freedoms, a free market economy, the defense of the traditional family, and the right to life from conception. That is why Paraguay's foreign policy is not based on mere economic interests, but rather on these shared values and principles. For these reasons, Paraguay cannot and must not evade the realities that are challenging world peace. Diplomatic prudence cannot become silent complicity. It is exactly at these times that the principles that define us as a democratic nation should be translated into clear and unequivocal positions with our friends and allies. Paraguay reaffirms here its unambiguous position. Israel has the legitimate right to defend itself. The terrorist attacks on the 7th of October 2023 against Israeli civilians were grotesque acts of barbarity which no cause can justify. We reject any biased attempt to equate the responsibility of Israel's democratically elected authorities with that of the leaders of the terrorist group Hamas. Anti-Semitism, ladies and gentlemen, as daily events show us, is no accident of the 20th century. It is alive and kicking. It forms part of that irrational cycle of violence and hatred that I referred to at the start of my statement. And I must confess here that I have never understood how so many have adopted this appalling worldview, given how much the Jewish people have contributed materially, culturally, and spiritually to the world. Yet, lamentably, this perversion persists among us. The only answer is to remain vigilant, to say no to hatred. Shoah never again. That is why Paraguay was one of the first countries in the world to designate both Hezbollah and Hamas as international terrorist organizations, and why it has consistently condemned their wicked acts. I decisively condemn these criminal organizations before you all again today. My country will continue to oppose those who deny the sacred value of human life, a fundamental idea that underpins Paraguay's vision of the human person. We also urgently appeal for the implementation of a solution that will alleviate the humanitarian situation in the Palestinian territories, bringing an end to the violence and securing the immediate release of the hostages, promoting a constructive dialogue that leads towards peaceful coexistence between both peoples and lays the foundations for a lasting peace in the Middle East. Paraguay's extremely principled diplomacy based on conviction rather than mere convenience also explains the moral stance that we have taken with regard to another democracy facing existential threats. Consistency in defending democratic values doesn't allow for selective geographies or calculations of convenience. Principles, when they are genuine, stand by their intrinsic worth, not by their political profitability. Paraguay has proudly maintained 67 years of diplomatic relations with the Republic of China, Taiwan. This friendship, forged through shared democratic values, has shown that cooperation between nations can be based on more than mere interest. Certainly, this decision costs us dearly economically, but believe me, the value of doing what is right is priceless. The growing tensions in the Taiwan Strait deeply concern us. Increasingly aggressive military exercises, constant aerial incursions, bellicose rhetoric, all of this points towards a dangerous escalation that could destabilize not only Asia, but the entire global order. Ladies and gentlemen, let it be said without timidity or pusillanimity, Taiwan deserves a place in this forum. Allow me to repeat it. Taiwan deserves a place in this forum. This is a matter of strict justice. Its exclusion from the UN system is an affront which undermines the legitimacy of our institutions. 23 million decent, hard-working and dignified people cannot remain invisible to multilateralism. Ladies and gentlemen, as in other cases, the question of Taiwan and its international status must inevitably form part of the discussions of this General Assembly. It is time to uproot this tree of injustice which has grown for decades and to give a place to Taiwan, China in the United Nations. These principled positions based on conviction and not convenience give Paraguay something relatively scarce these days, which is genuine moral authority to discuss the problems that afflict us. Against this backdrop of global crisis, Paraguay stands as an intermediate power with a central role in building consensus and strengthening the multilateral systems. Our words are backed up with facts. Paraguay has a characteristic constructive spirit in multilateral debates. In line with our active leading role, my country is currently a member of the Economic and Social Council, and we have national experts on the Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the Human Rights Committee, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the International Narcotics Control Board, as well as the Advisory Committee on Administrative and Budgetary Questions, among others. Over the term 2026 to 2027, we aspire to the presidency of the Bureau of the 6th Committee of the General Assembly, and we shall take up membership in the PBC. Dear friends, Paraguay stands ready to take its place in the concert of nations, not as a mere voice on the periphery, but rather as a true protagonist seeking solutions to global problems. Thus, Paraguay accepts and commits to the objectives set out in the Secretary-General's UN 80 initiative. These include the quest for greater efficiency in resource use, simplification of processes, and the review of mandate implementation. We therefore demand the implementation of geographic balance in the appointment of the next Secretary-General. This would strengthen the legitimacy and representation of this organization. In this process, we are convinced that attention must be paid to our region. Since we have candidates meeting the highest standards of experience, integrity, vision, and above all, leadership to build bridges, helping us to overcome challenges that are global in nature and that also pose systemic risk. We therefore call for a deep reform of the Security Council to prevent it becoming dispensable within a multilateral system that must provide solutions to the numerous current conflicts, both those between states and those caused by non-state actors. We call, therefore, for more flexible positions so that the Security Council can once again become truly representative in its membership and regain effectiveness as it fulfills its mission. We call for the elimination of the veto, which would bestow greater legitimacy on the body and would enable the UN as a universal organization to once again play a leading role in finding solutions to the great challenges facing our world. Madam President, distinguished delegates, I know that the picture I have painted here is not the brightest. Indeed, it is rather somber. But I preferred to speak truthfully, so as to not underestimate the gravity of our current situation. And yet, optimistic as I am, I can't avoid saying this. I look to the future with great hope. As the great writer William Faulkner said, I believe that humanity will prevail. With all of our flaws, when we work together, when we place solidarity above division, dialogue above violence, tolerance above hatred, humanity is capable of great things. Building the future is not possible merely by wishing it. Building the future requires intention, persistence, constancy, and discipline. I always say, and I'll repeat it here today, there are no shortcuts to development, just hard work. But words are no longer enough. Our peoples are tired of empty promises, of grandiose declarations that don't lead to bread on the table, safety in their streets, or education for their children. Just like in any relationship where trust has broken down, the key to recovering it is to show results. Democracy must demonstrate that it can deliver, that it can generate prosperity, that it can secure justice, offer hope, be a democracy with a human face and with a social heart, as defended by the great thinkers of my own political movement, such as Ignacio A. Pane, Juan León Mallorquín, and Fulgencio R. Moreno. My party has been demonstrating all of this in office in Paraguay over the last few decades. We have been showing that it is possible to grow economically with justice, with democracy, and with human rights. I'm not saying this arrogantly, but rather with the humility that characterizes Paraguayans. This is a humility born of a history of greatness, but also suffering. Paraguayans know the eternal cycle of rebirth, of suffering, crisis, tragedy. We have had to reinvent ourselves and rise from the ashes. And in that noble process, we have built the Paraguay that today is finally being recognized for what it is, a giant that is re-emerging. While the world is faltering, we are building something different, a model that is working, a model that inspires confidence because it's delivering results. The numbers speak for themselves. We have seen economic growth of 5.9% in the first quarter of this year, while at the same time the regional average barely reached 2%. Our inflation stands controlled at 4.2%, which is below the regional average. We are advancing firmly towards post-pandemic fiscal convergence. Our fiscal deficit has returned to 1.5% in the national budget for next year. Our unemployment levels have fallen to historic lows, 5.6% in the first quarter this year. But growth without social justice is worthless. That's why we are implementing ambitious programs to transform lives. Our Zero Hunger in Schools program feeds more than 1 million children a day in 7,000 schools. Che Rogapora is turning thousands of working families into homeowners. For the first time, the state is offering mortgages with payments equivalent to rent, transforming a monthly expense into family wealth. I stress that 118,000 100,000 people emerged from poverty in a single year. Extreme poverty fell to 4.1%, which is the lowest level in our modern history. But none of this would have been possible without solid institutions. That's why we've undertaken bold reforms. We promoted the Civil Service Act to professionalize civil service, ending with decades of clientelism. We have the Integrity and Transparency Act, creating true oversight and accountability mechanisms and strengthening the office of the Controller General. We've adopted a National Unified Registry Act, which proposes structural transformation and, after 100 years, orders land ownership in Paraguay. The outcome of this is that in July last year, Paraguay achieved investment grade for the first time in its history. Distinguished delegates, the Paraguayan model is not perfect, of course not. We face huge challenges and much remains to be done. But we are changing reality. We're showing today that Paraguay is not merely a country. As the president of the International Automobile Federation, Mohammed Ben Sulayem, said, Paraguay is the country. Madam President, distinguished delegates, I began this speech with some rather somber warnings about the state of global democracy and our societies. The times are grave, and there is much to worry about. But I do not wish to end on a pessimistic note. A different, better, brighter future is possible. It just depends on all of us. It depends on our ability to diagnose the problems with courage and to confront them with perseverance and conviction. The future isn't predetermined. Paraguay is living proof that, despite the chaos and desolation of war, it is possible to rebuild. It is possible to reconcile prosperity with justice, growth with sustainability, openness with sovereignty. Paraguay, dear friends, stands ready to be part of the solution. The sleeping giant of South America has awoken and is re-emerging with strength. We are ready to be a central protagonist in the struggle for humanity's great values, to be a leading actor in the concert of nations. Because we believe in a future where democracy does not merely survive, but flourishes. Because we believe in a future in which development reaches everyone, not just a few. Because we believe in a future where cooperation is based on shared values, not on mere convenience. Because we believe in a future where trust is earned with results, not with rhetoric. Because we believe, indeed, that humanity will not merely endure, but will prevail. That different future is possible. Paraguayans are building it every day. I invite you to build it with us, together, to leave behind a better world for our children and our grandchildren, a world with more democracy, more freedom, more tolerance, more justice, a world in which hope defeats pessimism, in which light overcomes darkness and good triumphs forever and always over evil. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Paraguay. The Assembly now will hear an address by His Excellency al-Sharaa, President of the Republic of Estonia. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. United Nations is an idea of a